Hi everyone. In this video, let's try to understand about storage account. So this is one of the basic services which Azure is providing in storing the data in Azure. And so there are different types of services which storage account is offering. And one is blob storage, one is file storage, and one is table storage and queue storage. Let's deep dive into what understanding what storage account concepts. So there are majorly few concepts involved in storage account, and if you see, we have to first understand what are the storage services. Why Azure is providing four different storage services, and which means that there are different types of ways we can store. There are different data types of data, and we have there is a different uh, features which Azure is providing to ensure that this type of data can be stored and provide a value added service for the customers. And then we have redundancy options, then we have performance. So what type of performance are you expecting in terms of a storage account? So based on your expectation in terms of a read and out or write operations and everything on a storage account, the performance defines everything. Endpoints. So what are the URL endpoints which a storage account is offering and through which you can access the different types of data? So our storage services in specific. And we have access keys and SAS keys. Access keys helps us in terms of accessing the uh, data or the same way in the same similar fashion SAS keys, but there is a good different amount of difference between access keys and SAS keys, and we'll get to that. And later on, we'll be actually talking about blob access tier and lifecycle management of the blobs, and then we have network connectivity in storage account. So what type of connectivity, what type of network you wanted to access this storage account? Do you have to wanted the storage account to have public access or not? Then we have recovery option. So in recovery, we can actually say how do we recover any deleted blobs or files or queues, and so respectively the recovery option is there. And then we have encryption. How do we encrypt the data in storage account? Then we have object replication, so we can replicate our data into another secondary region, and we'll deep dive into each of this. So this video is specifically to address half of the concepts because I want to make the video small, shorter. So let's jump into the first six concepts in a storage account, and that is understanding the storage services, the different types of data, and how do we different types of services which is being offered by Azure for that. One is Azure Blobs. So in Azure Blobs, we can actually use the containers, and in containers, we actually create the files. So container is similar like a folder. And what does Azure Blobs talks about? Azure Blobs says that if you wanted to store any data, specifically either it's a files or text files or images or OS images or MP3, MP4 or anything of such sort, and it's massively scalable. You can scale to a good amount of terabytes for a specific container. And whereas when you go with a files, for Azure files, it talks about you can actually ensure that you can store the same files, but in terms you actually create file share to ensure that specific file share has been accessed by multiple applications or multiple users or on-prem solutions and all that. And so that's where we actually use file shares. And similarly, it follows the same thing. You have the same file explorer method where you have files and folders in that. And that's what it is talking in each file share. You can actually store a lot of folders and files and all that. And why do we mention blobs is because you can actually go for binary large objects. You can store logs, you can store page blobs like OS images like VHD files and the text files and normal files. So any thing you can store in the container. Now comes the tables. What does table helps in? So you have a NoSQL data, like when you have a schema-less structured data when you wanted to store, you store it in terms of a key value pair. So you store it in a key value pair, and you so by default, when I'll show you how doesn't the data looks in tables and all that. And now in Azure Queues, so when you see Azure Queues here, it's we use it for the transactional data point of view. So any applications which are actually relied on transactional data and all that, or you receive specific messages of a smaller size, and you don't want that to be missed if that messages are not being performing some specific operations, all that, or you want it specifically a first in first out and all that, you can go for the queues. And queues are actually a very powerful one when you are using IoT devices, or you are using a transactional websites and all that, transactional based applications and all that. Trust me that queues will do a very amazing job. But other than that, we have tables, containers, and file shares. So each of this service is available in the storage account itself. Now, if you want me to show how does a storage account looks like, so I go into this, and this is a storage account. Once you create a storage account, you just need to provide a very unique name. And once you provide a unique name, these are the four services which Azure is offering in terms of storing the data. And once you store a data, you can access that going to each of the service. And user, you can assign to application specifically go and access only containers, file shares, or queues and tables. That's how storage account will be utilized for. And now let's understand each one in detail. Azure Blobs has three types of uh, blobs. One is page blob. So you see here, you're storing VHD files in that. And you have block blobs. So block blobs are nothing but the normal files, and you can store it to an extent. And append blobs is actually used for the logging. And when you append to another file and all that. And whereas if you see how does you create blobs, if you go into a storage account, in storage account you can create containers. So when I say containers, I'm creating two folders. So it's the other way you can say container as folder in our normal layman convention point of view. But in store, when you are trying to talk, or when someone is trying to talk, they don't mean that folders as containers, but you can create your own containers, and in that you can actually create sub folders or files and all that. Now, along with this, when you get into the next one where you have queues. So in queues, you can create multiple queues, and each queue can have different set of messages. And how does you, so whenever creating, you have a online website which is trying to get the incoming orders and the outgoing orders, so everything you can record that as in messages in a specific template point of view, how that naming convention or the messages should be there in the queues, and accordingly perform functions by applications which are there on the queue messages, on the messages which are there in the queue. And we have file shares. And when you're talking about file shares, so file shares are usually used for uh, when you wanted to access some specific set of files in the on-prem, and the cloud applications, you can use a file share, or you are actually storing your binary files from Azure DevOps. After this, you can create your own file shares from that. So there are different ways a file share can be utilized. Uh, but it was meant to say that you're sharing a set of files to a set of users, and they can actually make some concurrent views and concurrent changes simultaneously. And now you go with Azure Tables. So as I mentioned, you will always see a partition key and a row key for every table data. Along with it, you will actually see the data which you wanted to append with. If you're appending a specifically on balance, you will be seeing that. Or if you're specifically appending some key value pairs, you would be seeing that. But these are the common uh, rows which you can columns which you will see along with your data which you are storing in Azure Tables. Now, the most important part which you'll always see in Azure storage account is the interview questions even lies on that. What is the redundancy solutions which are being offered? Because in an organization, the most important or critical stuff is actually the data. We can recover if data is there even there when there is a entire downtime in the application and all that. We can come back to online. But if you lost a data which was there from the last gathered from the 5 years, and you can't recover it anymore. So that's the power of a data, and so it's a very critical thing. And even if you have a data lake, you will be losing. So the first option which Azure is providing is how much can you trust in terms of how much you can rely us on that data will not be lost, and that is called the redundancy. And to have the backup of your data, so that redundancy options are actually here, as one is LRS, ZRS, GRS, and GZRS, and RAGRS and RAGZRS. We'll try to get into each depth of each, what is LRS and ZRS and all that. So LRS means that you are in a data center when you are creating a storage account in a data center of a region specifically. Suppose let's say Central India. Central India it has three data centers, but when you are choosing LRS in Central India, so you are creating a storage account only in one of the data center only, not in all the three data centers, in one of the data center. When you're preferring LRS means locally redundant storage, and LRS means that when you create a storage account and you create your data you store your data in the storage account, there will be three copies which will be maintained in the same data center, so that even if your data has been lost in one of the data center, you have another two copies in Azure where you can read access your data from that. Why do we keep this? Because there is a chance of the data, suppose the hard disk can be corrupted or get hardware failures will incur, and because of that you might have a chance to lose your data. So Azure is saying that I will ensure that your storage account, whatever data you're storing in a storage account, I'll keep three copies in my data center. One copy from where you're accessing. In case if that's not available, then automatically I will give access to one of the two copies which are being there in the data center. And that's how storage LRS actually works. And whereas ZRS, no, you wanted more better backup option. So what if the entire data center has been failure has happened, or you lost the entire data center? Then you lost the entire data because you can't retrieve the data once back again. And because of this, some customers would prefer to have a ZRS. And in ZRS, when you are actually saying it's a zone redundant storage. What is zone redundant storage? You're actually creating it in one specific region, but you prefer the redundancy option, which is ZRS. And when you're preferring the redundancy option as ZRS, it means that when you create a storage account in one of the data center, it replicates the data. It creates the data simultaneously. Sorry, it not replicates, creates the data simultaneously in the other the two data centers which are there in a zone. So in a zone, we have three data centers, right? One data center and the D2 and D3. So when you're creating a storage account, it stores a copy in one data center, it stores the same copy in another data center. This happens simultaneously. So that's what you're seeing. Instead of three copies in same data center, you are distributing that each copy in each data center. What is the advantage of this? If there is a data center failure or you lost a data center, you can actually access data from the other data centers. But whereas here, it is only the entire data is in the one data center. So if one data center is lost, you are losing your entire data. So that's where we can prefer ZRS from LRS. But the only problem the Azure is saying that is you can we give it for a charge. And obviously, when your data is actually crossing some specific amount, you get charged a bit higher. And let's understand GRS and GZRS. So the next better option than ZRS is GRS. Why? Because what if there is a region failure? Okay, we have a zone. If I'm creating in a central India and I created it in, I took a zone, but what if the central India has been itself, there's a regional failure, then how could I actually recover my data or how can I access my data? At that point of time, you can prefer the best option is GRS. When you lost the data, there is no point. When there's a region failure and you chose ZRS, then you can't do anything. But initially, while you're creating the storage account, if you are preferring the redundancy option as GRS, then you can go for some solutions. And GRS, here it says that you create your data in one data center and it will maintain three copies in the same data center. Not even if it is a zone, it maintains in one data center only three copies, and it will replicate the data which is there in the storage account to another region entirely. And another region only in single data center, it will maintain three copies. Wo- So use of GRS is even there is a region failure or a data center failure, you can request Azure in terms of accessing this other copy in the storage account. And only so there is no manual fail, or there is no way or you can access directly the secondary storage account. You once there is a region failure, then automatically if you're choosing an option of GRS, then the other data center in other region, secondary region, you can access that data. What is GZRS? It means that the first primary region where you're storing your data, that is being distributed in different data centers in a zone. So when you choose ZRS, even if there is a region failure, you are losing the data, right? So in that kind of case, we can actually go for GRS, geo replication. Now, but in going to geo replication itself, before going, the primary region should be in a zone. If you wanted to choose that, you can actually go for GZRS. It says that you maintain each copy in each data center and replicate the other copy in one single data center alone. Another single, even that second region is a zone, even then it will be in one single data center and three copies will be maintained in that data center. And that's how GZRS works. But let's understand how a geo replication happens. When you are actually storing it in a primary region, so when there are these copies, this will happen simultaneously. That is called synchronous copy of the data simultaneously in all that the same data center. Even when you're going with the ZRS, a synchronous copy read and write or write operation will happen if you're writing or storing any files. Synchronously, it will store simultaneously store that updates the copies of all these three copies in the different data centers. But whereas when other secondary region, when it is replicating the data in the secondary region, it happens asynchronously. It means that simultaneous copy will not happen. There will be a bit of delay of 10 minutes or 20 minutes based on the amount of size of the data, based on the replication. Sometimes it will be very lesser, but there will be a delay. That's what the point is. This is an asynchronous geo-replication. It will happen behind the scenes, and obviously it is more costlier than so that's why GRS and GZRS are costlier compared to LRS and ZRS. The other solution which we have is RAGRS and RAGZRS. So if you see, the other than GRS and GZRS, we have RAGRS and RAGZRS. What is that? So you wanted to have a read access to the store when there's a data center failure and all that. You can actually have the read access to the storage account. But this happens, a manual failover should can't happen automatically when there's a data center failure. you will have read access automatically to the other region. And so if you wanted to have a read access similarly in Z zone point of view, you can go for Geo zone, RA Geo zone redundant storage, and it's a bit more costlier compared to the normal service. And what is about performance? Let's understand performance. When you're talking about performance, uh, we wanted, when you're storing the data in a storage account, we wanted to access the data for a different, might be we wanted to access once in a month, or might be we wanted to access 1 lakh times in a day. So we never sure how the data can want to be accessed. So based on the requirement, you can choose an option here. You wanted to go for a standard or a premium, and most of the accounts will be on a standard itself, which is general purpose V2 accounts. And general purpose V2 accounts obviously will be giving you most optimal and best performance. But when you wanted to dedicate, you wanted to use for a dedicated types like high transaction where storage very low storage latency and all that, that time of times you can go for block blobs file shares, where only these options are available when you go for a premium option. If you go for a standard option, you will not see the account types. It will be a general purpose V2 account, but when you're going for a premium storage account, you will have these three types of accounts. One is block blobs, page blobs, and file shares. And we have endpoints. So let's understand first of all, till now so far what we have explained while we are doing was things which we have seen as storage services, and I already made you see that. Next one is GRS and zone redundant, geo zone redundant, and local redundant. When where is RSGRS and RSGZRS? This is the option. When you're preferring GRS or GZRS, you will see this option checkpoint. But if you're going for zone or local redundant, you will not have that read access anymore. So if you wanted a read access to the secondary region where it is being stored, then you can go for this RSGRS. And how does uh, where can you see that even redundancy? You can actually go after you have created an account, you can see here, and you can change to read access geo redundant or GRS and all that. And as I created this storage account in East US, and you can see this options, geo redundant storage and local redundant storage, and this is the advantages of it. And furthermore, when we talk about endpoints, each of this, the store data you are being storing in the storage accounts, are there are four types of data. One is containers, file shares, and queue services, which are there in the Azure storage account. These are the services, and you can access the data in the services which are being stored using endpoints. So there are six endpoints totally, but right now the very important for the accessing four services, we have four uh, endpoints. And where is the endpoints here? Actually, it's here. Okay, in settings. And endpoints will be a bit more in similar naming convention. If you see, you'll have a storage account name, HTTPS. You can access them under the HTTPS, and blob.core for blob service, file.core.windows.net for file shares, queues के लिए queues.core.windows.net, and tables we have .table.core.windows. And here everywhere there is a storage account name. So why do we need to have a unique storage account name? Because the URL should be unique. So across the Azure, if you unless you create a unique storage and account name, you will not be able to generate unique endpoints, and that is the reason why you need to have a unique storage account name. And whatever the storage account name you have provided, you can just keep it. And if you have blobs which you have been stored in the blob services, you can actually access this from the URL. So that's the endpoint to access each of the services. And we have the other two more endpoints. One is for static website and one is data lake storage, and that's right now beyond the topic. Now let's understand yes, to access the storage account, we are accessing it through this endpoints. But uh, through what all ways you can access the storage account from the endpoints? So using these endpoints and all that. So first from portal, you can access your data in the storage accounts using the Azure portal. So if I went to Azure portal, I go into containers, and just because I have access to the storage account, I'm able to access the data and specifically can view the data. That's from the Azure portal. And you can access from a software called Azure Storage Explorer. So you can install this Storage Explorer, Azure Storage Explorer from internet, and you have to just provide access key or access to the subscription. And once that is done, if you're having the access to the container storage accounts, then you can retrieve what all data there. If it's containers, then you can retrieve the contain list of data in that containers and file share, similarly queues and tables. If you're having PowerShell, you can even if you're trying to use PowerShell, you can even access data from the PowerShell. Similarly, if you are having a data, if you wanted to access the data using CLI, you can use Azure CLI commands. And if you see, this is PowerShell command set -az storage blob content or retrieve. There's another command for it. And if you wanted to upload a blob or you to retrieve the blob and all that, there are Azure CLI commands similarly. And we have even SDKs like Python, Ruby, uh, what .NET, Java, and all the different types of SDKs to access. So we need to have an endpoint to access that service, the blob service or file share service and everything. Along with it, you can actually have from which you wanted to access. And then you need to be authentication also. There are different types of authentication when you're trying to access the data from Azure portal or Storage Explorer or PowerShell and CLI. Let's see that. So there are different types of authentications where when we are trying to credentials, you have to do is uh, access keys. So one is we have access keys, one we have SAS keys, and one we have RBAC roles. So let's understand each one. Access keys helps in terms of accessing the entire storage account, and there is a key one and a key two. So we'll have two keys in access keys. One is a primary key and one is a secondary key. So that even one key is compromised, you can use a secondary key not to while you're rotating the second key. So if you see, you can rotate your key one, and similarly you can rotate your key two. And once you rotate it, it will generate a new credential key to access the entire storage account. When you say entire storage account, you'll have access to the entire services, which is container file shares, queues and tables, and even what you can create or delete, and all that access will be there in terms of a storage account when you give an access to access keys. So it's not an optimal way to you provide access keys to the users in your organization. Instead, we'll prefer the option called SAS keys. Using SAS keys, their full form of SAS is shared access signatures. So it's a bit more vast in terms of concepts level of the usage of shared access signature. But generally, I'll show you. You can, instead of giving access to the entire storage account, you can mention which service you wanted to allow it for. If you only want for blobs, then you will select blobs and you will unselect the rest of the storage services, and you generate a access key, then a SAS keys. Then you'll only have, using that SAS key, you can access only blobs. Even there's data in files and queues and tables, you will not be in a position to access it. And when you go with access keys, there is no uh, expiration, but you can rotate your keys and all that, and the previous keys will be uh, deleted, or you will not be having any more access with the old keys. Now, if you're going with the SAS keys, you can actually mention just what specific permissions you wanted, because access keys will provide you all types of permissions. But in SAS keys, you can go for a granular approach, what specific access you wanted. Is it a read, write, delete, list, add, and all that. And next one, we have the expiration date. We need to enable enable the blob versioning and all that, which is recommended. And when you're going with SAS keys, you also have an activation date and a expiration date. And while you are using this one activation date, it will be a bit problem the first few hours because you have time zone also. So if you are using an on-prem machine which is there in another region entirely, there's a different time zone for it and all that. So during the first couple of hours or minutes, you will be facing a authentication issues and all that while you're having an activation date. But later on, after a day has been passed or a couple of once a time zones are been in aligned with proper after a couple of some 12 hours and all that, you will be in a position to have SAS keys functioning properly. But if your see SAS keys will be a problematic only when you wanted to when you have an authentication and when you're trying to share this SAS keys to different sources where and they are in different time zones if only during the initial time. But if you choose the present time as the authentication, then there will not be any problem. But still, this is something which you have to keep in mind that you will when you're sharing the SAS keys to different users in time zones, you need to wait for let the authentication failures initially happen, but later on it will keep working as expected. And usually we'll allow the protocols only through HTTPS. It's recommended to go with HTTPS alone. You can have the HTTPS and HTTP solutions also enabled. And when you're accessing from portal, you need to have, it's recommended to assign specific RBAC roles. So you have RBAC roles assigned. So backup contributor or a storage account contributor or storage key operator service role, data contributor, blob data contributor, blob data owner, file share owner, queues owner, tables, and accordingly you have different uh, RBAC roles which you can assign to the user when they wanted to access the data from this in the storage account. So in the next video, we'll be talking about the next further topics, which is blob access tiers, life cycle management, network connectivity, and recovery options. So in this video, I have discussed this. So please understand that these first six are very much important. You can expect some handful of questions in interview in any of this first six at least. And you will definitely, if you're deep diving, they're asking deep dive questions, you will be facing the next level set of questions. And please stay tuned for the next video so that I can actually talk about the rest of the services, rest of the concepts in a storage account. Thank you.